Okay, let's get right back into it with Patrick talking about the Waimarino Block.
But that Waimarino Block has got no title. The very block one right here in Marae has got no title over in the centre. Don't go back to any iwi group. Go back to the descendants of those people who were owners. And as you have to do with the Public Works Act, Section 40, if land is taken for a public work and not used for that purpose, it's got to be offered back to the descendants of the original owners. And you've got to find them. Now, if it's good enough to go out and search for Europeans, it's good enough to go out and search for Marae. And don't tell me that there's no records. You can go through baptismal records for the different areas. You can go through a whole range of records. They're all recorded. And just remember, all Marae could read and write. Okay? And government agents were all over the place recording who was where. Easily traced. Dead silence. Now, just on that one, you can check on this. I gave that presentation whenever it was before Marae Wards came in. On the Monday after that, there's a huge article in the Chronicle about nutcase middle-aged white men who get involved in some sort of obsessive research, and always writing letters to the Prime Minister, not that I have, but it was obvious. Now, these people normally end up killing themselves, this sort of stuff. So that's what you're up against when you bring up that non-title issue. But that's what Tieke was actually, at its core, what it was about. More so with Whakapapa. But if I can give you an example of how little progress we made, in the case of Whakapapa, some guy wrote in and to the Chronicle, and he claimed that Whakapapa was sold. Well, Whakapapa is a block up the Waitara Valley. It's nothing to do with the Waimarino Block. And that this Harry Haitana, when he claims it was stolen, is totally wrong. So I wrote a letter stating it was in the Waimarino Block, that there was no title, etc. They wouldn't publish it. So that's what you're up against. Now, the other thing, of course, that you're up against is my first cousin, Maureen Breen, was Private Secretary to Phil Williston, the Associate Minister of Justice, when Waikini was smashed over. She was out of the office at the time, came back and she said, you want to check on that? Those Wanganui people are setting up a wānanga. There's a report being done by the University of Waikato, which is true. And she just put a whole lot of land aside for it. Okay. She goes to check it out. All of the trusts that supposedly were established have been abolished. No, they haven't. Here's the documents. I was told by this is the parliamentary level, being told all of these land trusts have gone. They haven't. She came up and got my stuff and she's getting quite worried about it, right? All the way through, you've got this attempt to divert attention away. She said, the other thing she said was, Patrick, you're the biggest nutcase that ever existed at parliamentary level. I said, yep. And she said, what's going on? Are you claiming you're being followed? And I said, don't talk to me, talk to Jeffrey. Now, all Jeffrey said was, well, the data we did the T-shirt protest, or she didn't, but there were people in cars waiting in corners and that. She started getting worried for the kids, The other one was we had a cop, and rather he was very close mates with Alan Nation. And he went and he said, this is the day I'm getting, of the protest. Getting followed. Patrick's been declared a national security risk. Over what? This is the Alan Nation. So I go into the shop. I'm on my way to work because I couldn't get into the mountain. And he goes, look, there he is. Look at him. He's our very own national security risk. And he burst out laughing. It was so ridiculous, But that's how much the government fears the truth coming out about that block. Just think about it. You haven't got a title. This is not 5 acres. This is 384,260 acres from Taumarunui to Ratahi and from Mount Rupo to the river. Now, of that 384,260 acres, 88,000 belongs to another block called the Aotea Block. I mean, this is looking serious. So if there's no title, as one of those traditional Catholic priests in Wanganui said to me, who the hell owns it? Well, there's only one group who does own it. That's the problem.
One group who doesn't own it?
Who does own it?
Oh, does own it, yeah.
Marae. That's what it is. And you can't argue your way out of it. It is. There's no title. The judge ordered a title be issued to 1,005 people on the 16th of March 1886. Right? It hasn't been issued yet. Why? They couldn't advertise the survey plan, otherwise the people up in Taranui and round there would have seen that 88,000 acres of another block had been put into the Waimarino Block, right? So they weren't about to advertise it. The other thing was the plans, WD 772 and WD 776, both showed the boundary of the Aotea block. So the people in court would have thought, oh, above that's the Aotea block, below it is the Waimarino block. Because you wouldn't have a block there saying boundary of the Aotea block if it was irrelevant. Well, of course, it goes above that and around the Wanganui River and back down the Whakapapa River, that way. So, yeah, basically that's the background to the wider issues, wider background to what happened at Tieke. But Tieke was the first attempt to try and get something going, in my opinion, that would provide a basis for greater leisure time activity. And what we thought at the time was, okay, Whakapapa, you can do freshwater fishery, let's say. Tieke, you can do, weaving, and so on and so forth. So you had all these different attractions and activities going on which both preserved historical art forms, and not just Maori art forms either. You could have opera, you could have poetry. And just on that, when I was going through doing my research, a guy called Donald McLean came through the Taumatamahoi block from Waitara across to the Wanganui River in 1850. And he watched this. He was a Gaelic-speaking Scot who could also talk Marae. And he became very prominent in New Zealand society. But in those days, there were mutton birds on the Taumatamahoi range. Now, what this guy was doing was he was about to catch them, but he always said a prayer before he caught the mutton bird. And he wrote down the prayer, and it's in National Archives. And it's the most stunningly beautiful prayer you'd ever want to hear. But what I'm getting at is it's worth having that sort of thing in a scholastic environment, say kōrero or something, where people can sit down and learn that stuff, And the other thing is that, I know with chant, you're not supposed to quote one line, you're supposed to quote the whole thing, but for the purposes of the exercise, to illustrate a point, there was a very famous poet called Rangi Malta here. He used to live down Jerusalem way. Died some years back, or many years back. But he wrote a poem, a very famous river poem, comparing Parliament to birds in a tree, right? And they're all jumping around the tree. Now, I'll just take one line from it. You take, these days we call Parliament Wari Parimata, right? But if you listen closely, you'll see how clever this guy was. He refers to Parliament as, I'll give you the cadence for it, because you've got to have the cadence to get it right. Te ware wānanga o kuini wiki tōria, right? That's a totally different image, to what you get with wari parimata, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And what I'm getting at is that that sort of poetry is worth preserving. It's fantastic stuff, Yeah. Does that give a sort of basic sort of background to why we went in and what we were trying to sort of get to?
Yeah, that's a really big overview.
Yeah.
Hey, with detail, of course.
Yeah.
It's bigger than what I had envisaged we would talk about. I've still got some questions here.
Sure.
That probably the questions I've got are quite specific, I guess, to Tieke. But yeah, in the context of what we're talking about, having that overview as a basis to work from, it just makes my questions like, I should have gone broader with this in order to...
Oh, no, it doesn't matter. But there's still a specific...
Yeah, there's the specific, but from what I've heard, there's a lot more. There's a lot of other interesting aspects in the whole episode here, or in the whole thing, that warrants a bit more kōrero as well.
Yeah, sure. I'll just say one thing, though, that my father was sick once, and this would have happened about 84, 85, and he had nothing to do. He said, "Oh, what's going on up there?" And I said, "Oh, this guy called Amuhia, Hakai Amuhia, yeah." I said, "There's lawyer Eb Morgan, they're arguing about the Waimarino Block." He said, "Yeah." Sure, they reckon he never sold it, you know. Okay. Just send it down, the old man said, and I'll just, well, he's very good. He found everything in about 5 minutes and said, "I'm not touching that block." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "That's damn dangerous." He said, "I'll get you shot." Really? That's what he said. He said, "Yeah, because of what happened. If you've had judges carry on covering that aspect right up till Judge Wainwright, something's wrong, eh?"
Yeah.
And the other thing, that I went to my brother's 50th wedding anniversary, and one of the guests was a judge. He told me he was a lawyer. I knew he was a judge, High Court judge. And I said, "I've had a problem with the judiciary." He said, "What's that?" And I said, "Oh, a report was put out." He said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, I made some submissions on that report." And then suddenly a new report came out covering the same, but it was a summary. Right? He said, "What?" I said, "The original report disappeared into a summary, which you can't quote legally, you see."
That's just summarised.
Yeah, summarised. I mean, why do that? Why? You know what I mean? So, yeah, people tend to keep away from it. Anyway.
Yeah, the more you hear about, the more information you find, like listening to you, it's riveting. You know, I'm quite happy listening to it, because for me it's information and knowledge, but it also opens up a whole lot of other issues that now I'll start going and researching online, seeing what I can find, and it'll probably end up coming back to, "Hey, Patrick,
Yeah.
come on in. I want to ask you about this." Yeah, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
How long did that occupation last, and what were the main events or milestones during that time on Tieke itself?
Okay, well, what did they call just trying to remember exactly what they called the proclamation, where you had to stay at certain sites and pay dock. But we went on if I remember, the 15th of September 1993, okay? And it probably would have lasted about 5 years minimum. Probably, I've heard it said 10, but I don't think the 10 was continuous. But certainly for the first 5 years, it was definitely continuous. We had Larry Ponga from Wānanga LTO and Marae, and their family formed the core.
Yeah.
And Tanya, I can't remember the second name, from Otoko.
Tanya Tangaro.
Yeah, I was going to say McRitchie, but yeah,
She married a McRitchie.
is that what it was?
Yeah.
She was very much involved, very good. Whole range of people came in right place, right time, you know. And they set up a proper marae and fed everyone. So it wasn't really sort of pushing issues. It was more, well, we've got a right to be here, but since we're here, we'll set up a marae and we'll feed you anyway. You know, this sort of thing.
So that was handling the logistics of staying up there for an extended period of time.
Yeah. Well, it's a fun, just on that, I remember the jet boat, the first jet boat. I was about the only person with a full-time job. It was quite a hard case because a lot of unemployment back then. And they're going to buy this $8,000 jet boat, you see. And I said, "Well, how do you intend to do that?" And they were looking at me, looking at me for. And, of course, I had a credit card, you see. So anyway, okay. And then, of course, I became a very, very tight operator on the minutes and what have you, because I had $8,000 at stake. That sort of thing, you know, happened all the time. I was trying to think of different things that happened, but there's so much happened. It was,
Yeah. So it's dissecting all the smaller things, and I guess in regards to the occupation up there, what were their demands and the grievances of the occupants during the occupation?
Well, it coalesced around the government or the Department of Conservation charging for people to stay on, or forcing people to stay at certain sites on the river and charging them for it. And that incorporated Tieke, which was really, in the eyes of the locals, a marae.
So is this, we're talking about concessions and that sort of stuff?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, not just, but even like if you wanted to get down by yourself, you still had to pay over the season, right? Between October and March or something, I can't remember the exact times. And the average person would say, well, no, you can't, it's a marae. And not just that, but it was pinched, you know. You're not going to come in here and charge for that, you know.
Like me coming around your place, pinching your car and using it as a taxi, eh?
Yeah, and coming to pick me up.
Pick you up.
I'm not going to pay for it, yeah. Basically, yeah.
Yeah.
That basically was the antagonism that people felt.
Yeah.
Whatever.
How did the local community and the government authorities and other stakeholders respond to that occupation up there?
Initially, it was quite mixed. You know, a lot of people reckon that we didn't know what we were talking about. And this is Maori too, right? There were a lot of Maori who had a stake in the system, right? And they didn't want to have anyone creating earthquakes out there when they were sort of the reference people for what Maori was or wasn't. You know what I mean? I'll put it that way. The wider community was a bit funny. What interested me was the reaction of farmers. Now, farmers, and I always thought, were pretty racist, you know. But in fact, the farmers could see that the state was creating an image of these Maori that wasn't quite correct, in the same way as they could create an image of farmers that wasn't quite correct. So there's a more liberal approach amongst the farmers. It quite surprised me. They took a far more in-depth view of what we were talking about, you know, especially when they found out that there was no title, you know. They were all going, what?
So the farmers up there, for example, they had title to the land they owned?
Yeah, what happened, if you look at, this is a big problem with Waimarino Block, you got no title, so they create these subdivisions that don't come from anywhere. It's not having on. When you go back and try and find out, you're supposed to have a title to start everything, and then you break it up, right? Well, there's no starting one. That's how serious it is. So the survey department of the time were involved in registering titles against a parent title that didn't exist. Now that's getting pretty serious.
So how has it been gotten away with?
Because any person who brings it up is declared to be a nutcase, idiot, fool or dead. Basically, and that's what Lucy Heenan was getting at when she said, don't ever investigate the Waimarino Block. So they knew, but they also knew how dangerous it was, you know. And you can see their point, you know.
Yeah, that's pretty scary, eh?
Well, the last time it came up was, I was in Taumarunui, and they had a meeting of all the claimants from that area. So I said, what about Y221? And the guy didn't know about Y221. That was John Akapita's claim, which was originally Y37, and then became Y48, then became Y221. I never heard of it. So I said, well, we were in direct negotiation. Didn't even know. And that's 88,000 or 100,000 acres of his claim area. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So.
Okay, what role did cultural, historical or environmental factors play in the occupation, if anything?
Well, historical, obviously, it played a huge role. I mean, the history of what happened. Yep. Environmental, well, further up on Waimarino 5B7, which is the block next up, that's Pat Rongonui's area, sort of. That was one of those blocks that had as its constitution to establish and maintain that school. So from an environmental point of view, yeah, there was something we could have done in that context. What was the other part of the question?
What role did cultural, historical, or environmental factors play in the occupation?
Cultural, well, it became a marae. It was a marae, and we just re-established that environment. Yeah, that's as much as I can say, really. Yeah.
That's cool. So, were there any significant conflicts or negotiations during the occupation?
How can I put this? It's almost as if Marae culture is a bit like churches, right? You got one church that believes this, and they've all got the same God. One church here, and one group's got this series of opinions, and another group's got this series of opinions, and they really get into it, you know.
So each faction would have their own interpretation of what's going on and how to deal with it.
Exactly.
And they don't align with.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
So there was that sort of stuff going on.
I was secretary, right, and then people started to look at me as, why should you be secretary? You know, fine, I don't want to be secretary.
Who wants to be secretary?
Yeah, basically that's what happened. You take over. And, of course, I disappeared at that point, you know. How can I put it? People get excited, they want to get it stuck in, but they don't know the full history and background to what they're doing. And I might say this, that by the time we did Whakapapa, they'd learnt their lesson. And when I tried to resign as secretary, I thought no one would come in. So people had realised, hey...
that it was actually hard work and you needed some clues to carry on. Yeah. How do you think the occupation up there impacted the local community and the wider region?
I'll just give you one example. Johnny Nation, we're having a bit of a party for some reason, birthday party or something, and my wife worked for him, so we trotted along. And he comes up to me and said, what the hell is going on up the river? So I had to explain to him what it was all about. And once I explained it, he was quite supportive.
Yeah, I guess that's it. Once people, there's two sides to every story, and if you're only going to ever listen to one, you're not going to get a full understanding of the actual issue or the whole thing. You've got to listen to both sides of the story, and then you make your own decision on what you want to believe, and everybody's happy with that. Well, you'd be happy. I'd be happy hearing that side, and then put my own 2 cents worth in my head, and I'll be happy with it.
Yeah.
That's fine for my mental well-being. I can come up with an option that I'm happy with in myself. So otherwise you could go nuts. As this podcast relates to, you could go nuts trying to decipher all the corruption and underhanded stuff that's been going on. And it's not just with that block. Perhaps you'll know a bit about down the Paraparas, any land down that way, the Ohutu block.
Yeah, I've never studied it, but I've heard of it,
Yeah, so we've got my sister, that's another story, we'll talk about that another day.
Okay.
But, so what were the outcomes or consequences of the occupation, both in the short term and the long term?
Okay, well, the guy who later became the racial relations conciliator, I'll come to him in a minute, he comes up and we met at Mark Cribb's place across the river there, or Nancy and Mark's place. And we came up with a sort of a memorandum of understanding that the occupation would officially finish, but we'd stay there. So it was no longer viewed as an occupation. And we developed a memorandum of understanding, a couple of people to represent the Marae side of things and a couple of people to represent the dock side of things. But basically we could stay there until such time as the wider claims were dealt with. And those wider claims were dealt with the Wānanga River report and these other reports that subsequently were done, and where they left out a lot of relevant stuff. But however,
Yeah. How does the occupation of Tieke Marae fit into the broader context of Indigenous rights and land issues in New Zealand?
I I think the problem we had with Tieke was, as secretary, I kept on emphasising ownership rights irrespective of race. That what you had was a block without a title, and if the land was dealt with within the terms of the North Island Main Trunk Railway Loan Application Act of 1886, Section 4, Subsection 5, which set aside £100,000 to buy native or other lands lying within the boundaries of the schedule attached to the Native Land Alienation Restriction Act of 1884, which was basically the King Country. If it was bought within that context, or purchased or whatever, taken, then it should be treated as a public work. And if the land was no longer required for that railway, and especially if there's no title on it, then you had to trace all the people and where they lived and go back to those families and say, what do you want to do? You don't just set up an iwi group and say, right, you're representing all those people. You don't do it that way. You do it the way the wider population is dealt with in those same situations. They have to trace the family somehow, and they do.
Mm.
They do. So, yeah, from I always get sort of confused when people talk of Maori perspective because I'm not quite sure what they mean. To me, Tieke was an ownership issue, not a race issue. Do you get my point there?
Yep.
Yeah. I always had problems with this Maori side of things, you know what I mean? Yeah.
It's a stereotypical comment, really.
Yeah, it is.
That,
Because you're dealing with a particular group of people who descend from, their race is irrelevant.
yeah. It's no different to the stereotype that people with mental health issues have to put up with all the time too.
Sure.
So you're stereotyped, stigmatised as being a nutter just because you have mental health issues, which isn't actually correct.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. Yep, got it.
Yeah. So that's probably along the same lines. Are you aware of any ongoing issues or initiatives related to the occupation or its aftermath?
The only one that I'm aware of is that, how can I put it? When we were kicked out of the negotiations over the Waimarino Block, because we consistently stated that we couldn't negotiate, it would have to go back to the individual families and individuals within those families, and the Crown refused to deal with that, right? How can I put it? It was made quite clear to us that they would kick us out and find a group that they could deal with, right?
You weren't playing ball.
Yeah, but they would find a group of so-called Maori
Who would?
and they'd pay them off. And it was made quite clear, And we said, well, how can you pay off a group and have a final settlement full on a block with no title?
Yeah.
You can't. You can't have a full and final settlement on a block with no title,
Yeah, but we so often see this type of thing happening where, I won't mention names, however, we had some quite good, what I would, and at the time would have called pretty good activists around different issues. And they were really good. They were passionate about it. Yeah. Well, these same passionate activists who were there for the people, was a good thing, were eventually tamed, paid off by local governments or councils or whatever to toe the line, and so they lost that impetus or lost the interest in actually being activists anymore. They were more educators. They turned themselves into educators of a system that they were originally trying to defeat or challenge.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Yep.
Yeah.
I'll just say one further thing on the Waimarino Block, though.
Yep.
With regard to that particular issue you're talking about. A European gets up and blows off and screams and yells, he's a nutcase. He loves Maori or some other crap. A Maori does it, he's right. Well, he could end up in a very dangerous situation, I believe. And a lot of Maoris just won't touch it. I don't blame them at all. You know, the system can be pretty rough.
Yeah. I guess it's a case of choosing your battles.
Yeah, well.
So I guess this was a good exercise, and for me, try and understand the motivations, the dynamics, and the impacts of the occupation of Tīeke Marae. That's only a small portion, isn't it? Conversation is really just a small portion of a much bigger conversation that could be had around other occupations throughout the country.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. How can I put it? I was speaking to an officer I knew in the army who's now out, woman. She's an associate of my wife's at Queen Victoria Marae Girls College when my wife was there. And I mentioned, well, just an aside, how the Crown set up their national park and put their dual boundaries around the big Waimarino blocks and how we reacted. And we spread these blocks right throughout the park area. And she said, you learned that in the army, didn't you? You know what I mean? Yeah. Yeah. All sorts of things come up, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the only thing that I get hot about, I'll just go back a bit. There's a book called, I think it's called A Marae Chief, and it's by the grandson of a fellow up the East Coast, kōrero. What happened was, at the time of the ho-ho, they went up the East Coast and the traditional leadership resisted. And the traditional leadership, with the assistance of a very few European soldiers, won. Now, the immediate response of kōrero was to pardon those members of Ngāti Porou who had joined the rebellion, if you like. And then when the Crown came in to confiscate land, they kicked them out straight away. They offered £10,000 to one guy and they couldn't find one who would take it. Very lucky, very lucky. And they went down further, Wairoa way, and they got rid of the 10,000 there. Sort of collapsed the whole structure. But they're very lucky at that time around Ruatoria that they couldn't find one person, because all they had to do was find one, you know, and that would have collapsed. And then they had a conference at night after the sky. Everyone refused. And they said, we have to change. That the power of the Western world is so great that we're going to adopt what the Western world is doing in order to compete. And that's when they sent the young fellas out to get educated, and you had the Ngātas and all of the other people coming out of the woodwork. And they become extremely well educated very quickly. Traditional leadership, right, it's a skill. And they have the best interests of the wider group at heart. And they were just lucky, right, that they had group in place. How can I'm just trying to find the words that will fit. But basically, you've got to change. It's how you change and what you do and how it's led, you know, whether you're successful or not. Once that corruption creeps in, you're finished.
Yeah.
Does that give a view of the way I see things? Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's been a really, really thought-provoking conversation, Patrick. So I'd like to thank you for your time, and I look forward to having another chat with you sometime soon.
Oh, thanks very much. Yeah, that's all.